Welcome back to Vietnamese Special Forces Memoirs. After months of combat, minefields, and desperate escapes, Vu Quang Dong and his comrades are finally granted a short respite before the coming storm. Far from home and surrounded by war, even a few days of rest, a warm meal, and the company of fellow soldiers become treasured memories. After the hardships of late 1971, our unit was finally granted a short period of rest to prepare for the coming Tet holiday. Only much later did we learn the real reason higher headquarters was preparing for the Nguyen Hue Campaign. And since our unit operated like ghosts along Highway Shirsen, we were allowed a brief respite before being sent back into battle. Had we been in North Vietnam, a leave like this would have meant returning home, seeing parents, brothers, and sisters, perhaps even visiting a sweetheart or getting married before returning to the war. But here, behind enemy lines, where could we possibly go? Everywhere around us stood enemy outposts, fortified bases, and villages under government control. Even entering a friendly hamlet required local guides and trusted contacts. And even then, few of us would have dared. Friends and comrades were scattered across different units, each operating from separate bases. No one could simply drop by for a visit. That was the nature of the war. A war fought tooth against tooth. A war where leave meant nothing. So perhaps catching our breath was a better description. After only 2 days of rest, new orders arrived. We were to relocate immediately. Our unit left Bao Dung and moved toward a place called Suoi Can, somewhere near Dao Tieng, or perhaps Phu Riang. The transfer came without warning. Traveling light and guided by a liaison, we spent 3 days and 2 nights moving through the forest. At last, we arrived. Our new base lay beneath a low bamboo forest. Prepared shelters already waited for us. Beside them ran a shallow stream, almost dry. Ferns and wild vegetables grew thick along its banks. Perhaps that was why the place was called Dry Stream. From the base, we could see distant rubber plantations more than a kilometer away. The dry season had arrived. There was no rain, which meant every track, every broken branch, every sign of movement had to be concealed carefully. Soon after our arrival, the liaison led Bay Niep, Uncle Tu, and me to a nearby logistics station. Less than 2 kilometers away, there he introduced us, made the necessary arrangements, and prepared to leave. Before departing, he gave us one final warning. Be careful with fire. Don't let smoke rise above the trees. And whatever you do, don't throw anything into the stream. Enemy reconnaissance teams look for signs like that. We nodded. No reminder was necessary by then. Survival had become a habit. As was our habit, the moment we settled in, we conducted a thorough inspection of the surrounding terrain. Every new base had to be understood. Every approach route, every possible danger, every place suitable for observation and defense. While moving through the area, we discovered something unexpected. Not far from our position, another military unit was already camped nearby. They were regular army troops, main force soldiers. It had been a long time since we had seen a unit like that. Their uniforms were still relatively new, and unlike us, they possessed heavy weapons, mortars, recoilless rifles, heavy machine guns. Curious, we walked directly into their camp, asked a few questions, and were soon escorted to meet their commander. Many officers were gathered around a large sand table map. One quick glance was enough for us to understand. The model represented the provinces of Bin Long and Phuoc Long. A winding line stretched across the map. Highway E Sen, the road that ran north from Ben Cat toward the Cambodian border. The commander who greeted us was an older man, tall, thin. His skin carried the unmistakable marks of years spent battling malaria. Yet his eyes were warm, and his smile was kind. After a few formal introductions, Bay Need Jiep quickly got to the point. He advised the unit to establish observation posts farther from the main camp. Too many people were moving openly. Trees were being cut, firewood gathered, cooking activities created noise. Activities like these could attract unwanted attention. The commander listened carefully. Then, to our surprise, he immediately ordered corrections. There was no pride, no offense taken, only professionalism. One thing caught our attention. He addressed us as comrades. That word had almost disappeared. From our daily conversations, we had spent so much time operating in isolated teams that formal military language felt strangely unfamiliar. When he learned that we had come from Ben Cat, his interest increased immediately. He began asking detailed questions about Hai Sun, about Lai K Base, about enemy strongholds, about troop movements, about patrol routines. Bain Jeep answered everything, without hesitation. For nearly 2 hours, we exchanged information, maps, observations, experiences, warnings. There was no distance between us, only soldiers, sharing what they knew. With other soldiers, when it was finally time to leave, the commander accompanied us for quite a distance. Today, people often exchange gifts. When they part ways, back then, we had nothing to give. Nothing except a firm handshake and mutual respect. That was enough. Only later did we learn exactly who those men were. They belonged to Division C, the very soldiers who would soon fight some of the fiercest battles along Highway Shusen during the Nguyen Hue Campaign, and history was already moving toward them. Life at the new base was surprisingly peaceful. From time to time, groups of porters passed through the area. They carried ammunition, food, medical supplies, and everything else needed to support the war. Occasionally, we even heard the voices of young women among the columns. The sound carried through the forest, bright, lively, almost out of place, in a land at war. Yet, none of us approached them. Experience had taught us a simple lesson. The less attention we attracted, the longer we survived. Concealment was safety. Showing off was simply another way to get yourself killed on the very first afternoon. Headquarters logistics personnel called us in to collect supplies, rice, salt, cooking oil, monosodium glutamate, canned fish, and for the first time, in a very long while, an entire set of cooking pots. For communal meals, Bay Ning Jeep immediately assigned Quang and Liem to serve as cooks. Without delay, the two men began modifying their shelter. Before long, a Huang Cam stove had appeared. Hidden underground, its smoke dispersed through tunnels, making it almost invisible. From the air, Bay Nipiep had a remarkable eye for people. He quickly realized that Liam was an excellent cook. The very first meal proved him right. White rice, slightly stale-smelling perhaps, but pure rice, no cassava, no corn, no substitutes. Alongside it came sautéed wild ferns, sour forest soup, and salted pork. To us, it tasted magnificent. Only days earlier, we had still been eating wild yam roots. Just to stay alive back at Bao Dung, we could sometimes gather wild butterfly leaves or tropical weeds for soup. Here, we hadn't yet learned which plants were edible. Everything still felt unfamiliar. Talking about food brought back memories. Memories of fish, caught from the Saigon River, and the Thai Tin River, salted heavily, sealed inside ammunition boxes, buried underground. Months later, the fish would ferment slightly, developing a sour flavor that paired perfectly with wild yams. To us, it was a feast. War changes the meaning of luxury. 2 days later, headquarters issued more supplies. 5 kilograms of salted pork and 2 cans of Cambodian sardines for each man. Yet no one touched them. Instead, we carefully wrapped the salted pork inside plastic bags, then stored it away for emergencies. Years of combat had taught us a valuable lesson. Never consume everything. Simply because you have it today, you may be full. Tomorrow you may be starving. A soldier must always prepare for tomorrow, especially in war. 10 days of rest. 10 days with regular food supplies. For us, it felt almost extravagant. Everything we received would become valuable later. When we returned to Bao Dung, the dry season had settled over southern Vietnam. Day after day, the sun blazed overhead. The wind carried dust. Through the forest, dry leaves covered the ground. A single spark could start a fire. Tall grass grew higher than a man along the edges of the jungle. Because of that, we decided to celebrate Tet early, 12 days before the holiday itself. There was salted pork, canned fish, and rice that needed no substitutes. The Cambodian rice wasn't particularly fragrant, but it was sticky, filling, and more than good enough to remind us that spring had arrived. The area around our base remained unusually quiet. Artillery could sometimes be heard. Far in the distance, occasionally, enemy jet aircraft roared across the sky. But compared to Ben Cat or Cooch, life here felt peaceful. at least on the surface. Yet soldiers rarely trust appearances. We often told one another that this place might actually be more dangerous in Ben Cat. We heard bombs, artillery, and aircraft day and night. Yet somehow we felt safer there. We knew the terrain. We knew the enemy. We knew where to run. Here, everything was unfamiliar. If enemy aircraft suddenly appeared and attacked the area, escape would be difficult. If they dropped napalm, the consequences could be catastrophic. The nearby rubber plantations were too open, too exposed. There would be nowhere to hide. And so, despite the relative calm, many of us remained uneasy. Perhaps that is simply the nature of soldiers. After living with danger for so long, peace itself begins to feel suspicious. Eventually, our brief leave came to an end. We packed our belongings and prepared to return. To Bao Dung, every man carried a heavy load. But these burdens were treasures. Rice, salt, ammunition. The B-Celine gunners carried the heaviest loads of all. Each man struggled beneath 7 or 8 rockets. Bain Yep, despite his injured leg, refused to be left behind. Though he walked with a limp, he still carried a pack filled with detonators and slow-burning fuses. The same liaison who had guided us here now led us home. Oddly enough, the return journey felt longer. It took 4 days before we finally arrived. After 2 days of rest, our routines resumed. Once again, small teams spread out along Li Xuan Road and Highway Shisen. The Tet ceasefire was still in effect. Enemy troops conducted few operations. Civilian traffic, however, was unusually heavy. Families traveled south, toward Ben Ket, toward Thu Dao Mat. Watching them pass, their belongings piled high, their faces serious, we all felt the same uneasy sensation. A bad feeling, a sense that something large was about to happen. During one unit meeting, we discussed the situation, and almost without realizing it, we all reached the same conclusion. The year EZOTR would be different. Highway Shisen was about to become a road of blood. And before long, the war would prove just how right we were. About 2 weeks after returning to Bao Dung, around the 16th or 17th day of the Lunar New Year, we received unexpected news. Higher headquarters had officially commended our unit. Bay Nagyep was awarded another combat medal. As for the rest of us, each man received a small certificate. The paper itself was barely wider than 3 fingers placed together. Across the front were printed the words, "Victory Hero." It wasn't much, but to us, it meant a great deal. Everyone was pleased, yet the most memorable part of that day was not the award itself. It was the man who delivered the news. Sue, the same wide-eyed Sue we all knew so well. This time, he did not come alone. He brought 10 soldiers from infantry units who had been reassigned to join us, to introduce themselves to their new unit. The 10 newcomers carried supplies, a lot of supplies. AK ammunition, B cis, rockets, rice, salt, MSG, detonators, timing devices, slow-burning fuses, vitamin tablets, malaria medicine, bandages, and something we valued greatly, nearly 40 bottles of penicillin. Yet strangely, among all those supplies, there was no paper and no pens. War has its priorities. SAU also brought a special gift: 5 automatic Seiko watches, one for each team leader, for men who spent their lives measuring time by the position of the sun. A wristwatch felt almost luxurious. I don't think our unit had ever looked so prosperous. Everyone was smiling. Everyone was talking. For a brief moment, the war seemed very far away. Later that evening, conversation turned to the unit's achievements. Bay Ning Yep explained that when he submitted our performance report, he had listed only the missions we had completed. He had not included specific enemy casualty numbers. Some staff officers had suggested estimating the figures. Bay Ning Yip refused. Without confirmation, he would not invent numbers. The moment he finished speaking, Kin immediately jumped in. And once Kin started talking, nobody could stop him. According to his calculations, our unit had fought for an entire year. We had used around 30 mines. If each mine eliminated only 5 enemy soldiers, that alone would account for 150 men. Then came the B-40 rockets. 28 rockets. If each rocket accounted for only 3 soldiers, that added another 84 than there were. The hand grenades, the booby traps, the improvised mines. Kin kept counting and counting and counting. Soon, his total exceeded 500 enemy casualties. He delivered his calculations with absolute confidence, as though presenting a scientific formula. Bay Nyebjep sat quietly on his hammock, shaking his head and smiling. Uncle Tu and I could barely keep straight faces. The intellectuals had begun counting crabs in their holes, and once they started, there was no end to it. Kin's face turned red, but he refused to back down. "This covers an entire year of operations," he argued. "I'm only making conservative estimates. If we count the local militia, the Phoenix program agents, the informants, the village security forces, the number would be much higher." His confidence only made the rest of us laugh harder. Before Bainyep could respond, Uncle Tu decided to join the debate. "Kin does have a point," he said, "but Bainyep has already submitted the report. Let headquarters decide." Then, with a perfectly straight face, he added, "My team alone eliminated nearly 40 reconnaissance troops and Special Forces soldiers. And during the fighting at Bao Dung, we probably got more than 10. If we combine the achievements of the other teams, well, that's not a small number either." The moment he finished, everyone burst into laughter. I couldn't tell which side Uncle Tu supported. Was he calming things down or secretly encouraging Kin? Perhaps both. The truth was, our actual achievements might indeed have equaled or even exceeded Kin's calculations, but none of us could prove it. And honestly, what was the point? The war was far from over. There would be plenty more battles ahead. Finally, Bay Nijep raised his hand. The discussion ended immediately. Smiling, he delivered his verdict. Fine, when this next campaign is over, we'll count everything together. That answer satisfied everyone, at least for the moment. Throughout the entire discussion, Sue remained silent, watching, listening, smiling occasionally. A very wise decision. Only later, after we had left the shelter, did he quietly pull me aside. "You know," he said, "Kin means well. He's fighting for the unit's honor. But sometimes, people become too focused on numbers." He paused, then continued. "The war isn't over. The most important thing is to keep doing the job and trust that victory will come. Otherwise, you'll spend your whole life feeling bitter." I nodded. There wasn't much else to say. Deep down, I knew he was right. The war still stretched. Far ahead of us, arguing about numbers would not change anything. That night, Sue stayed in my shelter. There were 4 hammocks inside. Mine, Sue's, Tao's, and Ty's. After meeting with Bay Nijep, Sue returned carrying something unusual. Tea. Real tea. Not leaves gathered from the forest. Not some improvised substitute. Actual tea, he told me, to invite Uncle Tu and Kin over soon. All of us sat together, sharing cups. Beneath the darkness, the tea packet itself was amusing. Printed on it was a slogan that roughly meant Tan Tan Tea, the 2 horses at either end, along with a humorous warning not to mistake it for an imitation product. We laughed. Perhaps the tea tasted better because we had not enjoyed any for such a long time, or perhaps it was simply the company. Either way, it remains one of the sweetest cups of tea I have ever tasted. That evening, as we sat together, sharing tea beneath the forest canopy, Sue brought us news. From other units, most of it was good news. Reports of victories, successful operations, enemy losses, advances in different sectors. For a little while, the war seemed to be moving in our favor everywhere. Naturally, we began asking about old friends, men we had once served beside, men who had transferred away. Months earlier, Sue's expression softened. 8 men left your old unit, he said quietly. Only 4 remain together now. Dong, Tin, Long, and Lien. The others were wounded. Some are still recovering. For a moment, nobody spoke. War was like that. 1 month, a group of friends could be sitting together, sharing a meal. A few months later, they might be scattered across hospitals, different units, or battlefields. No one ever knew what tomorrow would bring. Trying to lighten the mood, I reminded Suo of something he had once told us. "Last time you visited," I said, "you told us we'd already won the campaign in Cambodia. But it was only February. The campaign didn't end until June." The shelter erupted with laughter. Sue laughed too, then shrugged. "Well, we were going to win anyway, so I wasn't wrong." That only made us laugh harder. For a few precious minutes, the war disappeared. There were no mines, no helicopters, no artillery, only tea, friendship, and laughter. Even now, more than half a century later, I can still remember the sweetness of that tea. Not because it was expensive, not because it was rare, but because of the men who shared it together. Life as a soldier was simple in many ways. We argued, we joked, we teased one another endlessly. And then, when danger came, we stood side by side. That was enough. The following morning, Sue prepared to leave. But this time, he did not leave alone. Tao and Sin went with him. Officially, they were being sent to report their experience with minefields and booby-trap operations. The two had become specialists in that dangerous work. At the time, none of us thought much about it. We shook hands, exchanged a few jokes, and watched them disappear into the forest. Only later would we realize that this was the last time we ever saw them. Years afterward, we heard fragments of news. Tao, it was said, was sent to North Vietnam to attend officer training school. What became of him after that, I never learned. Sin remained with the Special Forces Command. For a time later, he transferred to the 316th Special Forces Group. According to reports, he was killed in action before April 29, 1975. At least, that was what we were told. Whether it was entirely true, nobody could say for certain. War often leaves behind more questions than answers. The Nguyen Hue Campaign of 1972 would soon begin. It would become one of the fiercest campaigns of the entire war, and our small unit, despite operating on the fringes, would pay a terrible price. During all of EG-2E, we had lost only 6 men. In EG-2R, during this single campaign, we would lose 8. Even after all these years, I can still say this: war is merciless. It spares no one, and it never asks whether a man is ready. Strange stories from the eastern region. Eastern South Vietnam was full of strange stories. Anyone who lived in Ben Cat, between Bou Bai and E.Te, would never forget the loyalty of the people there. In our sector, most of our supplies came from civilians. The enemy imposed restrictions, conducted sweeps, tightened control everywhere. Yet somehow, the people still found ways to bring rice, salt, and food into the forests. Many logistics personnel lost their lives along the Saigon River and the Thai Tin River. Yet the supply effort never stopped. Again and again, men risked their lives to enter villages, purchase rice, and carry it back to the resistance. That was why rice was reserved for the wounded. The rest of us accepted hardship, wild leaves, forest roots, and wild yams often replaced meals. Despite years of repression, the people of Ben Cat continued helping the revolution. Food, medicine, information, everything moved quietly through invisible channels. Some village militia members lived double lives. By day, they wore government uniforms. By night, they served the resistance The enemy called them people who ate the nation's rice while worshipping communist ghosts. We simply called them friends. Many important warnings arrived through dead-drop mailboxes. Thanks to those messages, our unit escaped encirclement. More than once, and many enemy operations failed before they even began. There were even stranger stories. In some villages, local security forces had a curious habit. They occasionally forgot their rifles or ammunition or sacks of rice and salt along roadsides near rice fields. Then, upon supposedly encountering liberation forces, they would flee, often without seeing anyone at all. At Rakbab, armed youth groups sometimes abandoned weapons and grenades along the roadside before running away. Official reports claimed they had been chased off by communist troops. Reality, however, was often much more complicated. Even among Catholic families who had migrated south, in Ijo Sis, many quietly supplied rice, medicine, salt, and bandages to the resistance. In Thu Dal Mot, some deeply religious families secretly sheltered liberation soldiers. I experienced this personally. In May of 1970, local contacts brought me into Thu Dao Mot town for 2 days, and one night I stayed with a Catholic family near the church. The woman of the house, known as Aunt Tu, was nearly 60 years old. Her son worked as a police officer. He had a wife, 2 young daughters, and he knew perfectly well that his mother supported the resistance. Yet he said nothing. Southern Vietnam was full of contradictions. Some people spent their days giving fiery speeches about fighting communism. Then, at night, those same people guided liberation fighters into villages to eliminate informants and break enemy control. Looking back, I still marvel at the courage of the people of the eastern region. The years Ijo Liljo and Ijo Tilin were incredibly difficult. Danger surrounded everyone, yet countless civilians continued helping us, protecting us, feeding us, warning us. Without them, many of us would never have survived. The support network grew even stronger. During Ijo Te, many village contacts were reorganized and expanded. Even some local militia units played unexpected roles. During the day, they patrolled seriously, shouting orders, firing weapons, inspecting homes. Anyone watching would have believed they were loyal servants of the government. Yet after dark, some of those same men quietly carried rice and supplies through the perimeter fences and into the jungle. One year, our unit even received a letter from inside a village. Not from North Vietnam, not from headquarters, from the villagers themselves. The note was short, only a single sentence. Brothers of the Liberation Forces, if you need anything, just tell us. Please don't attack our village. Even now, I can still remember those words. They were both touching and heartbreaking. Of course, We still investigated. War taught us to trust carefully. Sometimes an invitation was genuine. Sometimes it was a trap. But most of the time, the message was sincere. There were villages where the village chief spent every morning gathering residents together, taking attendance, shouting orders, inspecting food supplies, all while enemy officials looked on approvingly. Yet later, those same men would secretly purchase rice, salt, and supplies for our logistics units. Some even guided liberation fighters into villages during special operations. Life existed in a strange gray zone, neither fully dark nor fully light, and somehow the enemy could never completely stop it. Years later, I came to understand why April of 1975 unfolded the way it did. Wherever our forces advanced, liberation flags appeared almost immediately. Many had been hidden for years, waiting for the right moment. There were other stories too, stories so unusual that they almost sounded fictional. Around Cu Chi, our logistics units somehow managed to obtain supplies that officially belonged to the enemy. Rice, corn, beans, salt, and many other necessities, sometimes entire truckloads, found their way into liberation hands. The drivers knew, the escorts knew, everyone understood what was happening. And yet, the supplies continued moving. A few of the escort soldiers became familiar faces. When they met our people, they often repeated the same request: if we ever meet on the battlefield, please don't shoot. Remember our faces. The request sounded strange, but it was sincere. Eventually, our comrades developed a standard reply: if you hear gunfire, don't shoot back. If liberation troops appear, raise your hands immediately and shout loudly, "It's me, don't shoot." Whenever those stories were retold, everyone laughed. Yet, behind the humor lay a deeper truth. War was rarely as simple as people imagined. Human beings were far more complicated. Years after the war, I met Special Forces veterans. From other regions, they shared similar stories. Stories of enemy trucks delivering supplies to liberation forces. Stories of officers' families secretly helping the resistance. Stories that would sound impossible to anyone who had not lived through them. But in Vietnam, during those years, such things happened, and that was simply the reality of the war. The battle along Highway 13. In April of 1972, the Nguyen Hue Campaign began. What followed would become one of the bloodiest campaigns of the entire war. Highway Shisen, sometimes called Li Xuan Road, stretched northward from Saigon all the way to Loc Ninh. Near the Cambodian border, it was more than a road, it was a lifeline, and before the year was over, it would earn another name, the Road of Blood. As early as January, major troop movements had already begun. Large combat units passed through our area. They moved quietly, disciplined, determined, yet their presence was impossible to miss. The most impressive sights were the heavy weapon units, Columns of soldiers carried long-range rockets. Others transported H-SHAR launch systems. Some units carried small sealed containers. We were told they contained the newest anti-tank weapons. Rumors spread quickly. Even tanks, people whispered, had finally reached the southern battlefield. The excitement was impossible to hide. Soon afterward, we received more information. After capturing Loc Ninh, our forces had shifted focus. The next objective was An Loc. Enemy forces were desperately trying to reinforce the area. Convoys moved constantly. Troops poured northward. Defensive positions around Thu Dao Mot, Ben Cat, and Chon Thun were strengthened. The enemy seemed nervous. No, more than nervous. Desperate. Reconnaissance teams appeared more frequently inside Long Nguyen Forest. And Bao Dung, artillery fire intensified. Aircraft activity increased. Transport helicopters, gunships, observation planes. Day and night, the sky remained busy. Since arriving in the Ben Cat area, I had never seen the enemy move with such urgency. Bay Ningiep spent much of his time meeting nearby units to coordinate operations. Meanwhile, our teams were sent out to gather intelligence. We studied Highway Shusen, the road from Thu Dao Mot to Ben Cat, from Ben Cat toward Bao Bang, and the approaches to Lai K Base. Kin's team was assigned to Wart Dong Du. After reviewing all intelligence reports, higher headquarters gave our unit unusual freedom of movement. We were authorized to operate up to 20 kilometers north or south of our normal area. For us, that felt enormous. Never before had we been allowed such a wide operating zone. But the opportunity created new problems. Our entire unit consisted of barely 20 men. To cover such a distance, we had no choice but to split into smaller groups. Smaller teams offered flexibility, better concealment, greater surprise, but they also carried risks. If a team was discovered, help might be hours away. If someone was wounded, evacuation would be extremely difficult. None of us liked it. Yet, orders were orders. And so, we prepared ourselves for whatever came next. Information from the battlefield usually reached us through the civilian porter units when moving toward the front. They carried ammunition. On the return journey, they carried the wounded. Sometimes, they stopped near our base to rest. Those brief pauses became valuable opportunities to learn what was happening. The information was never complete. One person might know about a battle 20 kilometers away. Another might have seen tanks moving toward An Loc. A third might know nothing at all. Yet, piece by piece, the picture slowly emerged. Whenever wounded soldiers arrived, we always went to greet them, partly to encourage them, partly to search for familiar faces, a fellow villager, a friend, a distant relative, someone from home. When we found one, the joy was overwhelming. Men embraced. Sometimes they laughed, sometimes they cried, But there was never much time. The wounded had to continue moving, and we had missions waiting. All we could do was wish each other luck and hope to meet again someday. Before operations began, Bay Nyepe gathered the entire unit together. Using maps and hand-drawn terrain models, scratched directly into the earth, he explained the situation. Every team participated. Questions were asked. Suggestions offered. Routes were debated. Possible enemy reactions were discussed. Only after everyone understood the plan completely did Bay Nang Jiep assign responsibilities. Each team received its own section. Of Highway Shirsan, 2 teams moved north. 2 teams moved south. My team received a different assignment. We were ordered to secure and monitor important communication routes. In other words, we would help keep the network operating safely. Once our mission was clear, we set out immediately. Many larger units already blocked sections of Highway Shirsan. For that reason, our unit focused on areas where enemy forces felt secure, near the entrance to Lai K base, near Benkat, near the approaches to through Dalmot, places where the enemy least expected trouble. Uncle Tu's team operated closer to Dongdu base. During that deployment, they successfully conducted 2 separate attacks alongside local guerrilla forces. At the beginning of March, rumors of major fighting began spreading. The reaction was immediate. Civilians started leaving. Families loaded belongings onto bicycles, motorcycles, ox carts, anything that moved. Streams of people headed southward toward Thu Dao Mat, toward safer areas by mid-April. The roads were crowded. Not only civilians, enemy soldiers also slipped quietly among the refugees, trying to move unnoticed, trying to escape what they knew was coming. We watched them pass, but we had no orders to engage. So we let them go. According to Bay Nyepe, friendly units along Highway 13 had already begun their operations. Artillery units, local guerrillas, infantry battalions. Together, they formed a chain stretching northward toward Baobang Tao and An Lok. The battles around Tao would eventually last 150 days. 150 days of almost continuous combat. Entire formations would be thrown into battle. Thousands would die. Vehicles would burn. Supply routes would be shattered. At the time, however, we knew only fragments, rumors, stories, bits of information. None of us yet understood just how large the coming campaign would become. As the fighting along Highway 13 intensified, our small Special Forces unit continued its dangerous work. Night after night, we crawled through mud, avoided enemy patrols, and planted mines beneath one of the most important roads in South Vietnam. At the time, we could not know how many battles still lay ahead, nor could we imagine how much blood would be shed. Before the Nguyen Hue Campaign finally ended, in the next chapter, the war along Highway 13 grows even more intense. New traps are laid. Enemy patrols become more aggressive, and survival becomes harder with every passing day. Thank you for joining me. 4-part Geo of Vietnam Special Forces Memoirs. If you enjoyed this story, please consider liking the video, sharing it with others, and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps preserve these first-hand memories for future generations. Feel free to leave a comment below. I always enjoy reading your thoughts and hearing where you're listening from. Until next time, thank you for listening. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in part sure.